Here's a simple question. Who are you?
I'm Georgia.
Dill.
Okay, but those are just words. Who are you? Where does your sense of self come from?
I guess my brain.
It's see through my eyes, so I think I'm in my head.
Where inside your brain do you think is you?
Christ alive, Max.
We all seem to know who we are on the outside.
Like a large beige jellyfish, but a lot cleverer than a jellyfish.
But it's often difficult to tell who we are on the inside. If you were to ask me, I might say, I am someone who occupies my physical body, a consistent inner me that began with my birth and will end with my death. That's me. But what if I'm wrong? What if you're an entirely different person from one moment to the next? What if your brain could be severed in half so that there were two consciousnesses occupying your mind? What if you are simply an illusion?
That would be unpleasant.
It would, wouldn't it? Now we know that our personalities change over time, so perhaps it's our memories that give us a coherent sense of self. After all, even when we change, we remember who we were previously. But research shows that our memories aren't fixed. They're constantly imagined, altered and distorted in our minds. When we remember ourselves in the past, we're concocting a story that often isn't true. So if we want to locate the self inside of us, we have to look deeper than our fluctuating personalities or shifting memories. We want to find something more fundamental, that consistent core that moves through moments and years. So where exactly inside of you is you? Now most people probably feel like they exist somewhere behind their eyes in this region of space. And this makes sense. Conscious experience almost feels like being a little person within the person, the operator of the flesh machine, watching your thoughts go by and controlling your limbs. But where within our brains can we find that little person? Where is the physical root of our consciousness? Well, amazingly, we don't really know for sure. Some of science's most popular theories, integrated information theory and global workspace theory, propose that our conscious experience arises from different parts of the brain working together. To operate effectively, the brain needs to unify many different unconscious sections of itself, from your memory to your vision to your emotional responses. And the combination of this information creates consciousness, an experiencing I, in which case I am the accidental byproduct of various parts of my brain processing a huge amount of information. But there's a problem here. You see, consciousness and awareness of yourself and your environment is sort of like a gradient. You can be a little bit conscious or a lot conscious. Other mammals, birds, mollusks, and even the occasional little ant guy sit somewhere on this spectrum. But there's an important thing that seems to separate us from most of the animal kingdom. We humans are not just aware of ourselves and our environment, we're also aware of our own consciousness, whilst ants aren't, hopefully. So perhaps we're looking in the wrong place. Consciousness might be spread out across the brain, but could we perhaps locate this rarer phenomenon? Where in the pink, fleshy muck we call our minds can we find self-awareness? Well, a lot of scientists have cast their eyes towards the very boringly named medial prefrontal cortex, which from here on out, I'm going to call the MPFC. In 2021, scientists took a bunch of people and asked them to use adjectives, which are words like groovy and lame, to describe themselves. But you see, some of this particular bunch had suffered damage to their MPFCs, and these people, whilst entirely conscious and functional, had little or no ability to ascribe traits to themselves. They didn't really know who they were. It seemed then that the MPFC was involved heavily in our sense of self. This experiment shone some light on a tiny part of your brain that could be responsible for creating your sense of me. But it also raised more interesting questions. Were the people with damaged MPFCs lacking a consistent self? Were they existing without that inner core that moves from one moment to the next? And more horrifyingly, what if the self manufactured in the MPFC is just a trick, an illusion of unity and identity? What if, brain injury or no brain injury, there really is no you? Well, another more disturbing theory has an answer to those questions, and it's about those big monkeys that aren't actually monkeys. According to the social brain hypothesis, the size and complexity of our brains is basically the result of hanging out with other apes. As our primate ancestors began to live in larger groups, it became necessary to understand the minds of others. If you wanted to cooperate, have sex, or just generally not be bashed to death with a stick or fist, you needed a sense of how others were thinking. So primate brains needed to evolve from being things that experience thoughts and sensations to the observer of those thoughts and sensations. The I needed a me. All right, that's enough. But here's the horrible bit. According to neuroscientist Michael Graziano, this me is an illusion. Primate brains simply began to run a simulation of an observer, creating the model of a mind so they could understand other minds. In this way, self-awareness isn't a higher form of consciousness. It's just another trick of your own machine brain, drawing its own ridiculous self-caricature.
This sense of self, evolved over millennia, is just an illusion. There is no unified you. When you have that sense of self, you're just becoming conscious of a simulation. Confused yet?
I am a constant state of simulation, produced and ran by my evolutionary brain as a means of understanding other primate brains, so I can have sex and stay alive better. Okay, maybe it's time to play a little game.
Consider this thought experiment. Right now, you've got a few thoughts floating around your head, but you also assume that there's a thinker having them. You exist above your thoughts, almost like a third party, considering them and making decisions from above. But if the self is illusory, you are just your thoughts. Now, close your eyes and focus very hard on the thinker inside your head, the person that's having these thoughts. Now keep focusing. You might find that you can't really locate them anywhere. All that's left is, well, thoughts.
And this is what many scientists and philosophers mean when they say the self is an illusion. They mean you are only your thoughts. There is no thinker having them. In which case, is there really a you at all? Now, no one is more convinced of his own non-existence than psychologist Bruce Hood, so I travelled to Bristol to see if this charming man could dissolve me into a sad little puddle.
So Bruce, this is a confusing situation, because I'm sitting here across from you, but on some fundamental level, I don't exist.
Physically you exist, but what you think you are is not what it really is. So that's why we call it an illusion. Because illusions don't mean you don't have an experience, it's just not what it really is. Most people, when they think about themselves, have this experience or this very powerful phenomena that they exist inside their heads, sort of looking out across through their eyes, controlling their hands and their limbs like a puppet master. But in fact, there is no solitary, unitary little self inside your head. That's what we call the homunculus. And for reasons of logic, there couldn't be a single homunculus inside your head, because the question then is, well, who's inside their head and so on. So it becomes like the Russian doll problem. I think the majority of mental processes are basically unconscious. You can bring them into consciousness, or they can emerge into your consciousness if they have a priority. But most of the time, you're not aware of all the various processes that are operating in the background. It's only when we draw our attention towards them that they become mindful of it. So we're not always clear of the decisions we're making or what's influencing those decisions, yet we have that profound experience that we are making the choices, when in fact they could be rather unconscious.
So sure, the self isn't real. Your sensation of consistency, the you feel, is a big old lie, courtesy of your developing animal brain. But here's a much stranger thought. For this entire video, we've been talking as if you have one conscious experiencing self inside of you. But what if, right at this moment, there's more than one you in your head?
Let's take a quick trip back to the 1940s, when an American doctor came up with a pretty out there idea, treating epilepsy by removing the connection between patients' left and right brains. Over the decades to come, scientists noticed that this procedure created some very strange side effects for many patients. Their two hemispheres suddenly seemed to have their own individual perspective and impulses. These people weren't necessarily one person anymore. This famous patient, known as Joe, was shown a variety of words to the right field of his vision, and could easily read them.
Gun. Good.
But when shown a word like phone on the left side of his vision, which is confusingly the field processed by the right hemisphere, he was unable to repeat what it was.
Didn't see.
This is because his left hemisphere, dominant in verbal processing, wasn't aware of the image. However, shockingly, Joe could draw a telephone with his left hand, controlled by his right hemisphere, but he was unable to vocalize what the drawing was.
I don't know what it is, I can't tell. Not very good. Whatever it is.
Other patients could even seem to argue with themselves. In fact, one infamous patient apparently tried to hug his wife with one arm whilst attempting to attack her with the other. So who was the person in question, the hugger or the attacker?
Conclusions from split brain experiments vary massively. To some scientists, they're evidence that it's possible to harbour two consciousnesses simultaneously and independently in one brain, two experiencing minds in one body. Other scientists disagree, claiming that these are just strange physical side effects. There remains only one single conscious agent.
Michael Gazzaniga, the pioneer of split brain research, came to a pretty amazing conclusion. He said the idea of dual consciousness is actually reductive because there are hundreds or potentially thousands of processing systems all active at once in the brain.
Which raises the rather unsettling question, what if there are other parts of your brain experiencing and being right now that the you hearing these words is unaware of?
I am one of many experiencing modules in my complex and frightening brain. There are others too, but they're not talking to you right now. And I don't know why.
Perhaps our sense of self is just a simulation. Perhaps we have many selves that give a false impression of unity. Perhaps you're a machine mind that just occasionally notices itself.
Either way, these aren't the most pleasing things in the world to hear, are they? So can we perhaps find a modicum of hope in not being completely real?
Say some problem you're currently considering, maybe it's financial, maybe it's a relationship, and say to yourself, I am worried about whatever your problem is because it makes me upset. If you then reflect upon your feelings, you're probably going to feel a bit upset. But if you immediately change that from being the first person perspective of I and talk about yourself in the third person, so Bruce is worried about this interview because he thinks he's making a fool of himself, then that becomes less stressful. Somehow switching from this egocentric self perspective into one which is more from someone else's perspective seems to reduce the emotional impact of it, as it were. So that's the sense of self changing.
Funnily enough, neuroscientific research around the illusory self seems to have found an unlikely ally: Buddhist philosophy. Within the spirituality of Buddhism, the experience of a consistent self is illusory. Instead, we are a constantly changing stream of consciousness. And this is why meditation, brief bouts of thoughtlessness, can be used as a tool to disassociate from your manufactured identity and live a more peaceful life.
If you deny the existence of the self as Buddhism teaches us, then in many ways it removes a lot of that effort to try and kind of satisfy something which doesn't really exist.
And researchers at UCL have used psilocybin, the psychoactive ingredient in magic mushrooms, to treat depression using a similar method. In trials, the drug was used to deliberately dissipate people's sense of self, a form of ego dissolution that Buddhist scholars also refer to as the Great Death. This allowed participants to dissolve and rebuild parts of their self-image and profoundly reduce their depressive symptoms.
It's not particularly nice on the surface, is it? Humouring the idea that you don't exist in any fundamental or fixed way, that your sensation of moving coherently from one moment to the next is an illusion born retrospectively out of your weird little brain. But if you'll allow me this saccharine platitude, perhaps indulging in the illusory self can demonstrate our incredible capacity for change, our ability to become happier or more empathetic, and to move beyond our subjective experience of the world and ourselves. So the next time someone asks you, who are you? Think hard. Because maybe the answer is...
I am an illusion of consistency, meshed together in a barely comprehensible way. For all intents and purposes, I, as I know myself, don't really exist. And that's okay, I think.
If you're a fully grown person with access to the internet, things probably feel a bit confusing at the moment.
Deep fakes, fake news, libertarian AI bots on Twitter, all creating the sensation of our post-truth world.
But surely among this pile of stinking artifice, we still have a few things left to trust. Surely at the very least, I can rely on what's right in front of me, what I see with my own two eyes.
Well, here's a list of horrible facts. A lot of what you see is generated by your brain rather than your eyes. Your sex, cultural upbringing, and even the language you speak affects your vision. And perhaps most shockingly, your social prejudices can change what you see.
Now I know what you're thinking, the bold man's talking nonsense, but here's something that might change your mind.
Focus on the cross in the middle of the screen. Just keep your vision right on that cross. Now you might start to notice over time that these faces in the periphery of your vision start to look a little bit horrifying. Of course, they're not actually changing. This is quite literally all in your head.
So why is your brain telling you porcupines? Well, as it turns out, your vision is always focused on one central spot, the fovea, which is about the size of your thumbnail out at arm's length. Outside of this, your peripheral eyesight seems just as detailed, but research shows it's actually far less accurate. Your brain is filling it in constantly, generating images to give the illusion of coherent eyesight.
And every now and again, the brain can't keep up with filling in these blanks, and you notice a discrepancy, which is why those faces begin to look terrifying.
In fact, this illusion might even be the result of your brain joining the faces together, working under the assumption that it's seeing a single person. Now obviously these things are all incredibly unsettling, but they also raise the question, can we really trust anything we see?
Like you, I was left feeling confused and a little bit sick about only seeing a fraction of reality. So I travelled to the University of Sussex to meet Anil Seth, who has quite the theory about our sense of vision.
Just imagine being a brain. You're locked inside the skull. All you've got access to as a brain are these electrical signals that come in through the eyes and the ears that are only ever indirectly related to what's out there. The brain is always making predictions about the causes of the sensory signals that it gets. It's a process of active, top-down, creative interpretation. So we never see the world as it really is. We only ever see the brain's best guess or best model of what's actually out there.
It turns out the brain is bombarded with far too much stuff every second to actually process all of it. So over the course of evolution, it developed to focus on the essentials and make predictions about the rest, which is why these illusions work.
But even those essentials, that thumbnail worth of reality we'd like to imagine is ubiquitous, differs completely person to person.
Research implies there's even visual disparity between the sexes. Women seem to differentiate more clearly between shades of colour, whilst men seem to excel at detecting fast-moving objects in the distance.
Differences that researchers believe might come down to variable levels of testosterone, but it's not just biology that changes what we see. It turns out even our culture messes with our perception.
People who speak languages with more specific terms for colours, for instance the Greek distinction between light blue and dark blue as two separate words, actually see that difference. Research shows that after living in the UK for some time, Greek people will start to see two shades of blue as more similar. This optical illusion, in which the top line appears shorter than the lower one, is far more likely to work on you if you grew up in an environment with buildings and straight corners. People who live in round huts are unlikely to be tricked.
We like to think we're all seeing a fixed and universal reality, but it turns out the uniqueness of our own minds, our DNA and our cultural identity all contort our visual perception. In fact, the reality we see is so malleable, we can even flip it on its head. Back in the 1930s, a Russian scientist forced his subjects to wear silly goggles like these and remain, sometimes for weeks, with upside-down vision.
Now, as well as being funny, this experiment was also pretty interesting.
You see, the participants' brains were able to adapt shockingly quickly. The upside-down world became the norm and thus seemed right side up. Something I'm hoping will also happen for me.
Starlight,
Yeah.
out beyond your window, speaks all.
Remarkably, the lens in our eye actually casts an upside-down image on our retina. But by the time our brains have encoded this image, we perceive the world as upright. And this might be why after some time, these remarkably confused test subjects began to function surprisingly well, with some even able to cycle through a busy city, something I also sort of did.
I don't know how to break on this thing.
All around us, catch me when I fall out of your.
But things got even weirder when the test subjects removed the goggles. Their brains were so used to the upside-down world that upon taking them off, they experienced the same disorientation as when they first put them on. The striking conclusion of this experiment is that even when our realities change enormously, our brains adapt. Something as seemingly ridiculous as an upside-down world quickly feels completely normal. And this is because our brain understands reality as what it's used to, not necessarily what's real, which actually poses some serious problems for society.
If we all see the world slightly differently, then we're all going to be biased in slightly different ways as well. And the worrying thing here is we're not going to realise this because the world seems to be the way it is to us. So if I see things to be a particular way, it doesn't seem like I'm applying any particular bias to it.
As early as the 1950s, scientists showed fans of two football clubs identical footage of a match. They found that the fans perceived moments of foul play entirely differently depending on their club allegiance, disagreeing completely about what they were seeing.
Now, obviously this is shocking, football fans being historically among the most level-headed and rational people in society, but studies of European protests showed similar results.
Participants in these experiments perceived the actions of police and protesters entirely differently based on their own ages and backgrounds.
This all takes us to 2017, when the American Psychological Association unearthed perhaps the most shocking disparity in vision ever discovered.
They asked 950 online participants from the United States to look at images of various men and judge the size and potential threat factor of each. Time and time again, these participants perceived black men to be larger and more threatening than equally sized white men. Even something as seemingly obvious and universal as size was totally malleable to people's perception.
Horrifyingly, it seems that our social bias and prejudices can actually distort what we see.
Other research showed that white female college students perceive black children as less innocent than their white counterparts, and white male police officers had a dehumanization bias against black people, more able to match them up with photos of big cats and apes. Of course, we don't need to look far to see the dangers of this. In the worlds of policing and law, bias this extreme can mean life or death.
But if some of that bias is unconscious, entrenched in our human senses, how can we ever hope to resolve it?
Well, Anil's team are developing something that might mark a step in the right direction. The perception sensors, an attempt to codify the disparity in our senses. The purpose of this project is pretty simple. We'll never be able to experience each other's realities, but what if we could shed light on the diversity of our inner worlds and comprehensively understand the differences?
This is a set of online, simple, interactive illusions and experiments and surveys. The perception sensors is a way of trying to understand this hidden landscape and convey to people that take part some of the magic and mystery of their own minds, the power of their own perception.
As part of the perception sensors, scientists have also opened the Dream Machine, an immersive experience where participants close their eyes and are faced with a combination of white light and sound, designed to generate an individual and hallucinatory experience. The subjective sensations of these experiences can then be documented in the sensors. As you can see, even when faced with the same colourless strobe lighting, the creations of people's minds are fascinatingly eclectic.
Just acknowledging that we all see the world in our own unique ways is really powerful, because it gives us a way of understanding each other's perspectives. How did my brain do that? It's a real kind of revelation that you've got that sitting in you all the time. You can do that anytime.
It was the most vivid, kaleidoscopic, unimaginable thing. It's really hard to believe that's something your brain's just generating with some strobe lighting.
Our eyesight, the most basic foundation of our reality, is subjective, hallucinatory, and often completely wrong, which leaves us guessing at just how deep and murky the separations between our realities really are.
Before resolving these inner differences, we'll need to understand them. So it seems long overdue that now, 6 million years into the complex evolution of our ancestors, scientists are attempting to recognize these divergences and illuminate just where our worlds collide, tangle, and contradict one another. It's safe to say, they've got a lot of work to do.
Watch carefully, this is happening right now.
You're walking through a sunlit street. Notice everything. The man coming towards you using the floor as a bin. The somewhat sweaty woman. Take it all in and then turn your head. There's a bloke over there having a pretty bad day. And in this moment, time slows. Every second seems to unfurl and linger as you watch him flail about. When you retell this story, you'll use the words, "It felt like forever," but it wasn't forever. So what's going on? It turns out that time is far more strange and mysterious than we might imagine. In fact, it's possible that past, present, and future could be an illusion, and according to some, time doesn't exist at all. So let's start with your own mind. Your experience of time is not constant because you don't have a perfect ticking clock in your brain. In fact, your brain creates your sense of time by putting your memories into order. It doesn't count in seconds, it counts in moments it deems important, which means it isn't always accurate. This is why time can feel like it slows down in unusual or stressful situations. Confronted with something new or scary, your brain thickens up the event with more details, like this quite memorable look of pure horror. And those denser memories give an impression of having lasted longer. For this particular man, every moment currently feels like an eternity.
I'm a foolish dreamer.
His childhood, laden with unfamiliar and mystifying experiences, also seemed to last a hell of a long time, whilst the blur of backaches and paper cuts to follow swept past him in an instant, which is something he's just beginning to realise. But you see, your memory isn't the only time meddler. This was me 56 minutes ago. A combination of alcohol and mindless chatter has filled my brain with the feel-good hormone, dopamine, which in turn has sped things up considerably. On the other hand, physical exercise slows our sense of time, which might explain why running is so repellently long and boring. And perhaps this science explains why our lockdowns, stressful and strange yet without many fun or memorable experiences, might have left you feeling that it somehow lasted forever and also flew by.
So okay, there's a lot of things twiddling about with our internal sense of time, and we've all experienced this. When we say time flies when you're having fun or felt like an eternity, we're referring to our own heads. But what about the real time, outside of our subjective experience? That consistent, unwavering time that rotates planets and ticks away on our watches.
It turns out that's just as weird. You see, Einstein's theories of relativity literally warped our understanding of time. Far from being a universal flow from one moment to the next, passing at the same rate for everyone, these theories showed that time and space are interlinked. You see, as stupid as this sounds, time can be warped by two things, gravity and velocity. Suddenly, after Einstein's theories, time moved faster in some places than others.
Every single suggestion of Einstein's theory, every single prediction has been confirmed up to now with just unbelievable accuracy. So ultimately, as he created it, the basis is that there is no notion of simultaneity at spatially separated points.
No notion of simultaneity at spatially separated points. To better understand Julian's point, we'll need to meet our jogger's twin sister, Agnes. Right now, our jogger is reaching the literal peak of her run. There at the top of the hill, she reflects on her grotesque finance career and plays out a fantasy. What if she stayed up on this hill, quit her job and pitched up a tent among the birds and the bugs? Let's humour her fantasy for a moment and say she lives up there for years, further away from the Earth's gravitational pull than Agnes, who remains in her sad basement apartment. By the time the novelty of hill life wears off, our jogger will return older than her twin. Agnes, down in her musty basement and closer to sea level, was existing in a time slowed more by Earth's gravitational pull. One twin is now older than the other. It's only a small difference, but a difference nonetheless. And this fact, mad as it sounds, has been scientifically proven. So yes, your head is older than your feet. Now let's make the twin situation even madder. If our jogger was to travel away in a high-speed rocket, moving at an obscenely high velocity, she could feasibly return decades younger than her now very hairy sibling.
These revelations seem to confound our sense of time. Clocks in the UK and China might be adjusted for time difference, but surely we're all experiencing the same time. Surely now here is now in China too.
Well, as it turns out, your now is completely different to anyone else's. Although we can interact with one another and feel we are sharing the same moment, our time is only ever relative to other people. Because we occupy different spaces, we exist in different times. No simultaneity at spatially separated points.
An unsettling fact for sure. So what comfort does this leave us with? Perhaps just the pathetic knowledge that whilst our nows can't be shared, they're at least real, realer than the happened past or the yet to happen future.
Well, maybe that's all wrong too. Of course, we experience time as moving in one singular direction. Cause precedes effect, the past is set in stone, and the future remains a mystery. Many physicists believe that this arrow of time arises from something called entropy, the idea that the universe is becoming increasingly disordered, a process that only seems to work in one direction. After this awfully rude man drops his apple, it's exceedingly more likely that it will decay and disintegrate rather than put itself back together. And it's perhaps this march towards disorder that explains why time moves forward. But nowhere in the fundamental laws of physics is there any real distinction between past and future. According to science, time could just as easily run backwards. So what if we were to look at time in a wildly different way? It's time to introduce the block universe theory, and for that, we'll need some bread.
So here's my loaf of bread, of which I'm naturally very proud. So you can imagine that if we reduce the dimensions of space from 3 to 2, so that would be space at one instant, two-dimensional, and then the vertical direction would be time.
Here inside our loaf of universe, every point in time can be seen as occurring simultaneously. Other times are sort of like other places. They're still real, you just can't see them.
There is this Latin saying, sub specie eternitatis, from the perspective of eternity. So you, looking at this loaf of bread now, are looking at it as if you were seeing it from the point of view of a divine God, from the perspective of eternity. It's all there at once. Our past, when you arrived, is just a tiny bit further down the loaf, and when you leave, you'll just be a bit further up the loaf.
Within the block universe theory, the past, present and future are all as real as each other, and all happening somewhere in this space-time. Your future, rather than being an uncertain mystery, is just happening at a different point in the block. Similarly, the entire history of the universe, from your ancient ancestors to the yet-to-be-doomed dinosaurs to the Big Bang itself, all occupy an eternal point in Julian's bread. Time isn't passing from past to future because every present moment is already there. As such, our experience of time is simply an illusion. This might even mean that our sense of free will is also an illusion. We feel we can change the future, but according to the block universe theory, it's already set in stone, concrete. You're just not there right now. So if this is true, why can't we stare directly into the moments to come, or turn around and trace back through the past? Well, perhaps we can only blame our sad, half-assed human perception. Perhaps it's not the march of time itself that locks us into the present moment, but our own duncy brains. We are, after all, not quite the eternal divine beings Julian was referring to. In this way, the block universe theory is by definition incomprehensible. We can't see time, the fourth dimension, so trying to fully understand this theory is sort of like trying to imagine the universe before it was actually a thing yet. So let's take a quick breath and make things a tiny bit worse by permitting Julian to go a step further. What if time doesn't really exist at all?
There is no such thing as time that is quite independent of what you and I are. It's not some invisible river which is flowing forever. Time is what the philosophers say, it's an emergent concept. It's something that we deduce from other things. It's an appearance that comes out of other things.
How about we return to the present for a moment? You want to know what difference this all makes. Let's say the passage of time is an illusion, the past is no more real than the future, that time doesn't exist at all. Who cares?
In 3 minutes, the man you're watching will be dead, and this moment will be a memory. Then you will age and also die.
Behind me is the picture of my father when he was 7, and then he changed a lot. If there were a picture of me at that age, I would look very different now. It is we that change, not time, because time just isn't there. We are here. I mean, there's no doubt you're sitting there in the chair opposite me.
Time may be simply born out of change, but we have no way of escaping this change. These theories of time can't free us from our limited perception, but they do reveal just how bewildering and incomprehensible our universe may be. It might not be of any comfort to the man, but in this moment, he is dying, and in another, he is being born, and both moments may be as real as each other. When we look at our friends, we see their light as it was, not as it is. Everything we see has already happened, but still we seem to feel the now, remember the past, worry and dream about the future. It may well be that our perception of time is outrageously wrong, and one day physics might prove with certainty that the future has already happened, or that time doesn't fundamentally exist at all.
But as the small, self-experiencing fractions of the universe we are, all we can really do is count the seconds, days and years of our brief time here, and wonder, perhaps, if beginning and end are really as different as they seem. Watch carefully, this is happening right now.
You've probably been here before, haven't you? Sitting alone in a dark room, fantasizing about people who might be willing to kiss you, or even, dare I say it, love you. You see, our entire lives seem to revolve around love. That desperate search to share a bed, a mortgage, and ultimately a life with someone who isn't your hand. But the other day, I read some quite nasty things on the internet. They said that love is just hormonal, an animal reaction, that we don't consciously choose our partners, our tastes were decided before our birth, and that the chemical proteins that cause true love only last for 12 months. So I wanted to know, are we really romantic slaves to a chemical soup sploshing about in our blood? And if so, could I trick someone into falling in love with me?
And then urinated a bit.
Oh wow.
To unravel this big pink mystery, I headed to meet Professor of Social Psychology and bona fide love expert Viren Swamy.
Since you're the love guy, have you been able to effectively cheat your way through your dating life?
I would say probably not, mainly because I think it's one thing to have the knowledge and it's another thing to apply it. And applying it in real life can be really tricky.
When we think about love, we normally consider that the first step is obvious. Good old-fashioned attraction, a seemingly instant biological reaction flowing from brain to groin.
So attraction is a kind of initial sense of feeling like you want to be close to someone. It's a sense of kind of wanting to affiliate in the kind of more technical sense of it.
And when it comes to attraction, first impressions do seem to count. In fact, some scientists have speculated that there may be some truth to love at first sight. Evolved intuition allows individuals to rapidly evaluate a suitable partner in about 100 milliseconds. emotions. Our apparently very horny ancestors weren't messing about. As soon as we experience this attraction, our chemical brain kicks in, flooding our body with dopamine, the reward hormone, and norepinephrine, which gives you butterflies and sweaty hands. And when that attraction becomes romance, oxytocin and vasopressin get involved, which scientists believe create feelings of intimacy and attachment. It seems then that even long-term intimacy has a horrifyingly chemical basis. In fact, studies have shown that people who have more oxytocin receptors in their brain are more likely to develop lifelong pair bonds. So whilst you might consider yourself a whimsical romantic, perhaps you just have a few more neurological receptors than your more relationship-adverse friends. Perhaps love is less fairy tale and more extremely unsettling deterministic biology. Whilst we might like to reduce the chemical explanation for love and lust, it can't be denied there's some pretty strong stuff in our blood. In fact, the hormones associated with attraction and romance are the same ones released by drugs like MDMA, which is aptly nicknamed ecstasy, and some scientists are pretty confident that this makes MDMA a genuine love drug that should be studied as a possible tool for relationship therapy. And I for one would love to see this beautiful form of therapy trialed on my parents. So okay, there's a lot going on inside the strange, unseen world of our loved up minds and bloodstreams. But what exactly is it about certain people that sends our bodies into a drugged up frenzy? Well, if we listen to evolutionary psychology, there's a pretty clear and universal set of traits that make for an attractive mate, prevalent across all cultures. Evolutionary psychologists basically claim that we're still stuck with dumb hunter-gatherer brains. So anything we see in someone that would have been advantageous to survival and reproduction about 2 million years ago continues to tickle one's pickle in the present. According to Professor David Buss from the University of Texas, men fancy women younger than themselves with a low waist to hip ratio, traits that apparently scream, "Look how fertile I am," whilst women prefer older, richer men who are big and strong, indicators that they can provide for any offspring and bonk any potential threats to death. But evolutionary psychology has also faced a heap of scientific criticism. For a start, it's inherently untestable. We can't ever know what people were thinking or doing over a million years ago. It's also based on a very specific and unproven idea that the brain is split into specialised modules, whilst many cognitive scientists believe that the brain is far more malleable and can change massively based on personal experience and environment. Finally, a science that claims our entire psychology is driven by a desire to reproduce can't really explain things like homosexual relationships. So there's that. According to other scientists like Viren, the things we look for in potential partners are strikingly different.
As a social psychologist, I would argue that most beauty ideals are constructed within particular social contexts. And that is the reason why you typically find quite wide variation in what is perceived as attractive, what is perceived as beautiful across different cultures, across time. It's not just about physical attractiveness, it's also about non-physical traits, like your sense of humour and whether I'm attracted to that. It's our sense of similarity, whether I feel like we're similar people. It's about the reciprocity that occurs in the relationship. Are you reciprocating my intimacy with you, for example?
So within this more complicated cultural understanding of love, is there any unifying tactic I could put to use myself?
The 36 questions was based on the principle of reciprocity. It's based on the idea that if you take turns reciprocating the exchange of information, you're much more likely to have to develop a sense of closeness. And it was developed by Arthur Aaron and his colleagues in the 1990s as a means of developing close contact between people. So people who engage in the 36 questions are much more likely to feel a sense of closeness compared to people who engage in small talk for the same period.
Sitting there next to Vera and I began to wonder, could I utilise this sweet and endearing exercise to trick someone into falling in love with me? To find out, my producer set me up with a blind date so I could try the 36 questions on an actual human being.
Hello.
Hi, nice
to meet you. Sorry.
But I also needed a scientific method of measuring how well the date was going. Thankfully, oxytocin, the intimacy hormone, has a visual signifier. It makes your pupils physically dilate, so I set up a camera to monitor my date's eyes up close throughout the date.
So an embarrassing moment. I'm very blonde, as you can see, but I thought rehab was a country.
That's actually really good.
My embarrassing moment is I was once in a chocolate shop, and I saw some chocolates I didn't like the look of, and I was with a friend and I was like, oh, they look horrible, and I was going I accidentally retched so hard I was sick on the floor, and the woman behind the counter actually shouted at me so loudly that I started crying, and then urinated a bit.
Oh wow.
When did you last cry in front of another person?
When my dog died.
Mm-hmm.
a few
And
months.
just open them a bit more. Your eyes. Perfect.
Is that okay?
Yeah, that's good.
Um,
And just keep them. Try and just not blink.
I mean, that's very hard not to blink. How long?
Just for the rest of the story. You saying your dog died.
As the date finally wound to an end, I felt secure that both of us had a wonderful time.
I think it went really well.
Did you feel intimate?
I felt very intimate. Am I in love? You can't. How can you tell after one date? It would, it might take 2, 3, 4.
Do you think you'd see him again?
As friends, I think he would make a very interesting, fun friend, but probably not on another level.
Now, making someone fall in love with me came very naturally, but of course, that's not the end of the process. And what remains of the journey, judging by the 100,000 yearly UK divorces, global decline in birth rates, and 20% of people that will be sexually unfaithful at some point, doesn't exactly seem like a breeze. When we seek love, we're probably not chasing a rush of unconscious chemicals, or a brief connection that may or may not lead to sex. Most people are looking for something a tad more lengthy, and that isn't always easy. In 2005, Italian scientists found that the beginnings of love are associated not just with hormones, but with an increase in levels of proteins called nerve growth factor. But this physical change in new couples typically only lasted for 12 months. As a result, tabloids like the Mail Online hysterically reported true love only lasts a year, but this conflation is inherently ridiculous. Try as we might to understand our subjective experience of love through biochemistry, the words true love can't be reduced to science and mean remarkably different things to different people. So what is love? How can we define it? And can it be rekindled once its chemical components begin to wane?
Eric Fromm was a psychoanalyst, and he believed that there is a feeling of love, and I can feel that love within me. Fromm also believed that the feeling of love was relatively unimportant. He believed that love was really a demonstration of love. It's the doing of love. How do I do love?
Under this definition, the chemistry of love is usurped by its practicality. Love in the contemporary world has more to do with commitment and compromise than it does spikes in nerve proteins and relentless erections. Perhaps true love isn't the ephemeral, unconscious infatuation of our primate brains, but rather the beauty of remaining intimate and affectionate whilst also raising an obnoxious child and calmly debating the most effective brand of oven cleaner. But perhaps even this definition of love as an active and long-term commitment is rooted in our cultural history. You see, love can also be understood anthropologically. Within the Western world, love, in its current predominantly monogamous form, backed by social institutions like marriage, can be viewed as effectively economic. According to evolutionary anthropologist Dr. Laura Fortunato, Eurasian monogamy arose around 12,000 years ago with the boom of agriculture. Suddenly, couples needed to pass down valuable land to their heirs so their children could be wealthier and thus more likely to not die and pop out kids of their own. After all, mommy and daddy's genes needed to survive, so couples reached a compromise. A man agrees to pass down resources exclusively to one woman's children. The woman commits to sexual monogamy, so her children are more likely to be that man's offspring. From this obscene premise, the institution of marriage apparently arose, not out of our evolving minds, but from our evolving culture. In this way, every romantic novel and Disney flick you've ever indulged in boils down to a bleak advertisement for inheritance, which is both funny and sad. We can look at love from wildly different angles. Love is the proliferation of chemical messengers in your blood. Love is the unthinking drive of your monkey mind. Love is what you learn and where you live, or a commitment born from the need to give money to your dumb kids so they won't die as quickly. Or perhaps love is atavistic, a push towards producing offspring irreconcilable with the damage your prospective child will reckon upon this dying ball of water. Or maybe it's just a more intricate form of masturbation. Of course, love can also be non-romantic. While studies have shown that relationships are the key indicator of human happiness, friends and family rank just as highly as spouse. It's worth considering the tangle of chemistry, evolution, culture and uniqueness that underpins our sensation of love, so we can accurately diagnose just what it is we're really looking for in our relationships. Despite my best efforts, it didn't seem like the science of love offered any real tricks for me to cheat my way into the perfect romantic relationship. But ultimately, that's okay with me. Love is a confusing and complex thing, and for now, surrounded by friends as I am, I'm entirely content on my own. Remembering your past sort of feels like watching an old home movie, perfectly preserved in your mind.
But can you really trust it?
What if I told you that your earliest childhood memories are probably fake? That every single time you remember something, you can alter the memory, and perhaps most disturbingly, that entirely fictional memories can be implanted in the human mind, a science that was pioneered by the same psychologist
who testified in the defense of Harvey Weinstein and Ghislaine Maxwell,
and the same woman who's about to have a serious fiddle with my mind.
He became virtually the first American citizen to be convicted of murder based on nothing other than a claim of repressed memory that had returned.
Let's back it up a sec.
Ignore the murder stuff for a moment. How does memory actually work?
Well, memories are stored in your brain as a pattern of firing neurons, linked by chemical connectors called synapses. But these synapses can form and fade over time.
So every time you remember your first kiss or some other deeply humiliating experience, that specific network of connections becomes stronger, making it easier to refire that neural pattern and relive the whole ordeal. And if you just stop remembering, which you can't, those synapses are lost and you forget about the whole thing.
Now, tracing back through our memories sort of feels like navigating a dusty old library, where information has been filed and stored to be recalled later. But according to modern science, this isn't really how memory works. You see, memories aren't stored as fixed, unchanging sets of information. They're reconstructed entirely when we retrieve them, less like rewatching a videotape and more like redrawing an image over and over, and also being bad at drawing.
This means memories can constantly be distorted, coloured by new information or your current feelings. Each time we access a memory, it's more like our previous construction of it and less like the initial memory. Burping in the mouth of your first kiss quickly becomes a vomity spectacle, even if it maybe wasn't.
In fact, research has shown that 40% of people have a first memory that is entirely fictional. It seems that we regularly contort our own pasts, but what if someone else could?
One thing we can say about memory is it doesn't work like a recording device. You're essentially constructing a memory, and that's why people will construct a memory differently depending on the conditions of the moment.
You're watching Elizabeth Loftus, who has pioneered some of the most extraordinary and divisive work psychology has to offer.
This includes the now famous Lost in the Mall study. Loftus would gather adult test subjects and have them memorise 4 stories from their childhood, provided by older relatives. But unbeknownst to the test subjects, one of these stories was completely fictional. For instance, a tale about being, yes, you guessed it, lost in a shopping mall.
Shockingly, Loftus found that around 25% of the participants actually remembered this false event, and many even invented additional details.
Memory, it seemed, was vulnerable not just to time, but also outside manipulation.
Elizabeth's studies remain groundbreaking and controversial, but they also paved the way for even more unsettling research.
In 2015, Dr. Julia Shaw of UCL took things in a much darker direction. By compelling her subjects to remember false stories, apparently provided by their parents, she was able to implant memories of their adolescence that were not only fictional, but also criminal.
Participants remembered being the perpetrators of violent crimes during their teenage years. Thefts, fights, and even armed assault. Many even went on to describe what imaginary police officers called to the scene looked like.
So just let that sink in for a moment. Dr. Shaw seemed to prove that our memories are so pathetically feeble, someone could actually make you remember committing a non-existent crime. Do you remember orchestrating that brief but effective terrorist campaign as a 6-year-old? Because I do.
How is it you can plant a seed of memory and it grows into something so richly detailed? I think what's happening here is that people are starting to visualize the experience that we're asking them to think about, and that visualization starts to feel as if it's a real memory.
Elizabeth's memory implantation doesn't rely on wacky technology or sci-fi mind control. The trick to her work lies within the fallibility of memory itself. She'd tell her subjects that a false memory is authentic from a position of authority. For instance, the false testimony of their parents. From here, their minds would spin the lie all on their own.
Well, let's say we're going to plant a memory in you. I would say, Max, I've had a chat with your mother, found out some things that happened to you when you were 5 or 6 years old. Would like to see whether you remember these events your mother has told us about. And then I would present you with some true memories, things your mother told me actually did happen to you, and then a completely made up memory. Other studies have used stronger, more suggestive forms. Maybe they add an imagination component. Why don't you try to imagine how this might have happened, for example? That will boost the false memory rate.
But to Elizabeth, these techniques, a combination of authority and imaginative suggestion, are disturbingly similar to those used in certain forms of psychotherapy.
You'll see therapists who will say something like, oh, you've got the symptoms of somebody who was abused. You say you don't have any memory of that. Why don't you just close your eyes and imagine who might have done that to you? Well, that imagination activity, it is one of the key ways that we get people to develop false memories.
It's no surprise then that Elizabeth's work is controversial. If false memory implantation is this easy and our grasp of the past this vulnerable, then how much can we rely on them when it's a matter of life or death? For instance, testimonies in court. And what does science like this mean for the darkest of crimes? Well, Elizabeth herself was involved in one of the most shocking court cases of all time. In 1969, an 8-year-old girl disappeared in Foster City, California. Though her body was recovered 2 months later, the police didn't have a single suspect. That wasn't until 20 years later. In 1989, Eileen Franklin, a childhood friend of the missing girl, was struck with a sudden memory. A memory of her father, George Franklin, raping and murdering the girl. Thus began a complex trial that saw Elizabeth Loftus herself testifying for the defense of George Franklin.
What is the evidence for this idea of massive repression of all this horrible brutalization that she claims she suffered, including witnessing the murder? When I found that there was virtually no credible scientific support for this kind of mechanism, and I asked, well, where could all these details have come from? It became clear that virtually everything she was remembering was in the public domain. Part of, this was a high publicity case.
By 1990, despite Elizabeth's efforts, the jury decided that Eileen's recount shared too many details with the crime scene to be false. They found George guilty and he was sentenced to life in prison. But 5 years later, officials reinvestigated. The police realized that Eileen's memories had been recovered during hypnosis therapy, a practice in which false memories commonly materialize. And after her initial accusation, Eileen had also recovered memories of her father committing 2 other murders, but new DNA evidence proved his innocence in these. Officers then began to realize that Elizabeth may have been right. Eileen's memory, whilst feeling real to her, could have been unconsciously developed from existing sources. The case was overturned and George released, but the trial remains a pretty shocking example of a potential false memory leading to incarceration. It begs the question, just how common are false memories? And can we really trust our own justice systems? Elizabeth's court appearances didn't end with the Franklin trial. She was also called to the stand as an expert witness by the lawyers of some pretty infamous criminals, including Harvey Weinstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. Critics argue that in many of these instances, defense lawyers use false memory theory to cast doubt on victim testimonies and manipulate juries. Do you ever worry that false memory theory might ultimately clear some people of crimes they did commit?
I have testified, called by the defense to present basic memory science in cases that involve some pretty unpopular people. But just because they're unpopular doesn't mean they don't deserve a defense. Just because they're unpopular doesn't mean they did everything they're accused of. I think the scientific information that I and some other experts provide in a legal case is meant to educate the trier of fact about memory, to correct any myths that they might have, as many people do have, about the workings of memory, so that they can make a decision based on accurate scientific information.
Underneath all of this contentious research resides an uncomfortable question that seems to disturb the very core of our justice system. What if the police, through interviews and interrogations, could be inadvertently planting false memories?
Okay, I'll tell you about one case that I testified in, where the officer was interviewing a witness to a crime, showing this witness a 6-pack, 6 photographs, and saying, okay, do you recognize the person who committed the crime here? And the witness said, no, I don't recognize anyone. And the officer said, well, wait a minute, I see your eyes drifting down to number 6. What's going on there? And then it started, okay, yes, number 6, and now number 6 is the defendant in the case. So that's an example of something highly suggestive that happened in an actual case that we happen to be able to be aware of because that interaction was recorded.
Sentiment in the scientific community remains divided. Experts don't agree on how common false memories are, or whether the theory translates to traumatic and repressed memories. Whilst both sides of the debate will agree that memory is malleable to an extent, the question remains, is memory, despite its flaws, essentially reliable? And can we trust it as a form of evidence in courts?
Some scientists are highly critical of Loftus and Shaw's research, claiming that false memory experiments typically generate false beliefs rather than actual memories, and that only a small number of people are susceptible.
And because fictional and real memories are scientifically indistinguishable, they can't be told apart through brain scanning. Without other evidence proving or disproving them, we're left none the wiser.
Of course, most of us don't really have to worry about rogue scientists or hypnotist cops sticking false memories in our heads. The person to really worry about is you.
We know that our memories can be altered and even manufactured entirely by our own minds.
However, we also know from experience that our memory can be strikingly accurate much of the time, a wonderful mystery of science and an incredible feat of that pink spongy bit inside our skulls.
Ultimately, everything we perceive immediately becomes memory. By the time I've said the present moment, you're already remembering it. And as for discerning just how true your memories are, well, that's really up to you.